Hi everybody, Hassan Shariq, regulated Canadian immigration consultant, back with another video on Canadian immigration. In today's video, we're going to discuss a very important topic of residency obligations for Canadian permanent residents. There's a lot of confusion about it. People don't know what is the exact residency requirement, how to meet it, what exceptions are there if you've been out of Canada in certain situations, and what to do if you're not meeting the residency obligations. So for discussion on all of these, watch the video till the end. Welcome back. As I mentioned that in today's video, we will discuss the residency obligations that are there for Canadian permanent residents. And on this broad topic, I will discuss this topic in form of subtopics or subcategories, which will be, first, I'll tell you what the residency obligations are. Then I'll explain what is the difference between the PR status and the PR card. Now, there's a lot of confusion with that. After that, I'll brief you on few exceptions that are there to residency obligations, like how can you meet residency obligations even when you're not in Canada. There are certain situations. Next, we'll discuss the question as to, do you lose your PR status right when you miss out on meeting the residency obligations? Then we'll have a look at calculation of the residency days, and in the end, I will tell you what the law says. If you are missing on residency obligations, are there any solutions or exceptions provided for that? So for each of these, let's discuss these in detail. So first up, we have the residency obligation. Now, under the Canadian immigration law, the requirement is that every Canadian permanent resident is required to meet a residency obligation of 730 days in Canada within last 5 years time period. So first, this only relates to Canadian permanent residents. If you are a work permit holder, a study permit holder, or if you've already become a Canadian citizen, this does not apply to you. Secondly, it is 730 days accumulated in last 5 years. So 730 days to be accumulated in 5 years. So you're not required to meet the residency days in a go. 730 days is 2 years. Rather, within a 5 years time period, you have to accumulate it. So say for instance, you move to Canada as a PR, you stay in Canada for like a whole year, that's 365 days. Then you move out of Canada and you're away from Canada for a whole year. That's perfectly fine. You again come back and you live in Canada for next 1 year. So that's in total 730 days. If these are shorter trips in and out of Canada, that's perfectly fine as well. And lastly, the important thing is that this has to be accumulated in any 5 years time period whenever this assessment is being done. So say somebody landed in Canada in 2010 and now we're sitting in December 2022. So to meet the residency obligation, we look at the last 5 years from now. So we'll go back to the time of December 2017. And within these last 5 years, if the person has accumulated a total of 730 days, they meet the residency obligation. In that case, anytime before December 2017 does not matter if the person met the residency obligation or did not meet. If they met at that time, but they're not meeting now, that means that they're not meeting the residency obligation at this time. After this, let's have a look at the difference between the PR status and the PR card. Now, PR card is only a travel document that is issued to Canadian permanent residents so that when they are boarding a flight from outside of Canada, the airline staff knows that this is a Canadian permanent resident and they can let them board the flight. Having a valid PR card in itself does not mean that your PR status still is intact. And not having a PR card doesn't automatically mean that your PR status is lost. For those of you who are Canadian permanent resident, you know that when you land in Canada, that's the date when your PR status gets activated. Now, your PR card comes later. More recently, we've had a lot of delays. So card would have an expiry date based on when it was issued. Now, residency obligation, the first 5-year period is 5 years from the date that you land. So, there could be a situation where your PR card is expired, but your PR status is still intact. So these are two different things that you have to keep in mind. Sometimes people think that if the PR card has expired, that means their PR status is lost. No. If your PR card is expired and your PR status is still intact and you have to travel outside of Canada for an emergency or for something, and the PR card might take 2, 3, 4 months more to come, there is an option that you can travel, and then whichever country you are, you can apply for what is called a PRTD. I've actually made a detailed video on the permanent resident travel document. You could find that link and have a look if that's something that you would want to apply for. So PR card and PR status are two different things. The residency obligation has to be met for your permanent resident status. The holding a PR card does not mean that you are meeting that residency obligation in itself. Next up, we'll discuss some exceptions for your residency in Canada. So there could be situations where you're outside of Canada and you've not met the 730 days within the last 5 years, but you still don't lose your permanent resident status. First situation is where you are a permanent resident of Canada and you are hired by either a Canadian provincial or federal government department to serve somewhere outside of Canada for a specific time period, or you're hired by a Canadian business organization which has an office somewhere else and you've been hired by them to work for them in that location outside of Canada. Now, example is that you're a Canadian permanent resident and say, for instance, a provincial government has like a trade and investment office somewhere in the world, and you get hired by them and they place you in, say, Dubai. And for next 4 years, you work in Dubai for that Canadian provincial trade and investment department. Now, at the end of 5 years, when you have a look, you've been in Canada, say, for just 1 year, and then for next 4 years, you're outside of Canada, so you're not meeting the 730 days. But because you were hired by a Canadian government, a provincial or a federal government, and they posted you abroad, your residency status does not get impacted because of this. You come back to Canada, you still have the residency status, you apply for your PR card renewal, and that's perfectly fine. The second is where you are hired by a Canadian business organization. Now, there are some fine details with this. First, it has to be a Canadian business, which is incorporated, established here in Canada. So it has to be a Canadian company which sends you abroad. Say, for instance, you work for a multinational company, which has its head office in UK, and they have a branch offices here in Canada. And it is the UK company which is sending you abroad. That does not qualify you. It has to be a Canadian company which is sending you abroad. So if they send you abroad for like a posting abroad, it is not supposed to be a permanent job that indefinitely now you're working. For a certain time period, maybe 1 year, maybe 3 years, maybe 4 years, but a specific time-based assignment. In this case, again, if you are not able to meet your residency obligation because the Canadian business entity or organization posted you abroad for a few years, you still meet the residency obligations. You don't lose out on your PR status. You can come back, apply for your PR card, and it gets renewed. So this is one situation where you are hired outside of Canada by a Canadian government or a business and you don't lose out on your status. Next possibility is if you are a spouse or a dependent child of Canadian PR or citizen. Now there are two different possible scenarios. One, if you are a dependent child or a spouse of a Canadian citizen and that Canadian citizen is based outside of Canada, and you are accompanying them, and say if you're a child, you're dependent on that Canadian citizen. If you're a spouse, you're definitely going to be accompanying them. In that case, you don't lose out on your PR status because you're living with a Canadian citizen and they're living somewhere else in the world, so absolutely no issue. You still don't lose your PR status. If you are the spouse or a dependent child of a Canadian PR who, as I mentioned earlier, is posted abroad because of their job with the Canadian government or with a Canadian business who's posted them abroad, even in that case, you don't lose out your PR as long as you are the spouse or a dependent child of that Canadian PR posted abroad. So again, this is an exception. So these are all the possible ways where you might be outside of Canada and not meeting the 730 days requirement in the 5 years, but still you don't lose out on your PR status. Now let's have a look at the question as to, do you lose your PR status right when you don't meet your residency obligations? No. PR status is only lost when there is a written declaration that you've not met your residency obligations and you were given a right of appeal, you've not used it, or you've used it and the required process has happened. So say for instance, if you are somebody who landed in Canada, stayed in Canada for 1 year as a PR, but then what happened is that for next 4 years, you did not stay in Canada. And now it's just 6 months or just 2 or 3 months left before your first 5 years. It's literally not possible for you to accumulate those 2 years of residency that is required. This does not mean that your PR status has been lost. Your PR status is still intact. There has to be a written declaration. So if you come back to Canada, most likely at the border service officer, they'll have a look, they'll create a report that you've not met the residency obligation. You will be given an opportunity to appeal that, about which we'll talk in a bit. And then if you appeal, or if you don't appeal, then there is a time in which you have to leave. Once this whole process gets wrapped up and there is a written declaration that you as an individual have now lost your PR status, only then you lose the PR status. Not meeting the residency days in itself does not automatically take away your PR status right there and then. Now let's have a look at how to calculate the residency days in Canada. There's a lot of confusion with that as well. So keep in mind that any part of a day that is spent in Canada is counted as a residency day in Canada. So say for instance, you take a flight to Canada and you land at the airport at say 10 p.m. on a particular day. Because you've landed in Canada and you entered Canada and there was still some part of that day that you've been in Canada, that day will count as a residency day. You landed early in the morning and you spent the whole say 24 hours of that day, 20 hours of that day, or just maybe an hour in that day will be counted as a residency day in Canada. At times there are people who are working in say trucking industry or who are in airline industry and they have a lot of frequent travel in and out of Canada. So any day wherein they were in Canada, even for a small time, half an hour, 2 hours, 4, 5 hours, that will that it has to be within last 5 years. So say for instance, there was somebody who landed in Canada, they stayed in Canada for say about 6, 7, 8 months and then left Canada, and for next 4 years were not in Canada. They traveled back to Canada and at the airport none of the officers had a look and they were allowed to enter back in Canada, and then they stayed back in Canada for next 3 years. Their residency will be all fine, because if you have a look at their residency obligation in last 5 years, they would have met it. So that's how you calculate the residency days. For new PR, the way that they calculate the residency days is that if you have accumulated some days and you still have you're still within those first 5 years, if there is a possibility that the amount of time that is left you will be able to meet the residency requirement, then it's all fine. And for other people who've been in Canada as a PR for more than 5 years, they have a look at your last 5 years, and that's how you should be calculating your residency days. Now let's have a look at the important question of what to do if you are missing on residency obligations. Now, there are different situations. First, if you have not met the residency obligations, you have a valid PR card, you can travel to Canada. If luck is on your side and at the port of entry, the border service officers, they don't really go deep into calculation of your residency days, you get in, all great. The advice in that case is that don't leave Canada after that. Don't apply for your PR card. Don't leave Canada unless you have met the residency obligation after this entry. So you have to accumulate those 730 days now. So that's one option. Second is that if you don't have a PR card with you, which is expired or that's an issue, then there is a possibility that you could travel to United States. You could enter Canada through a land border. If you provide your landing papers, there is a possibility that you're allowed in. And again, if no questions are asked, you get in, and then don't leave Canada for the time that you meet your residency obligations or you accumulate it. Lastly, keep in mind that if you are not meeting your residency obligations, you still have a valid PR card, say for instance, or you apply for a PRTD. As I mentioned earlier, that your PR status is not lost automatically. You will be given an opportunity to appeal, and there is the option of appealing against the humanitarian and compassionate grounds. It's a difficult one, but this is the only possible solution where you can go into an appeal and you say that there were circumstances which were beyond your control, like somebody really got ill, or if it impacts, like if you have family established here in Canada and you have children and you, because of some reason which were beyond your control, had to stay out of Canada for a longer period, and now you're not able to meet the residency days right now, you could go for a humanitarian and compassionate ground appeal. That if your permanent resident status is taken away, this is going to create a lot of hardship for you and for your family in Canada. And there are certain possibilities. If you need any help with this, as an RCIC, I can take up your case and we can see what solutions are there. And even for others, if you're not meeting your residency obligation or you have questions on that, you can book a consultation with me. I can have a look if you're meeting the residency obligation, or if you're not meeting, what possible solutions could be there if you need to go for the HNC application as well. So if you're not meeting residency obligations, if you have a valid PR card, my advice is travel, do landing, get in Canada, and then till the time that you meet your residency obligations, don't go away, don't apply for the PR card. You could also try entering through the land border by showing the landing papers. That could be one option. And if you have a genuine reason, there are options of doing an appeal on the basis of humanitarian and compassionate grounds, although it's a difficult one. So these are the different means through which you could still retain your residency if you're not meeting the residency obligations, and enter in Canada and again regain your permanent resident status. So that's all on the topic of meeting the residency obligations as a Canadian permanent resident. I hope I've been able to add some value to you. If you have any questions, any queries, you're more than welcome to drop it in the comment section. For those who are in a situation where they're missing out on their residency obligation, or they would want to do a HNC application, or they want to have a calculation done on the possibility of them meeting the residency, you can always book a consultation with me. The link is in the description of the video, and I can provide you professional advising on that as to what is the best course of action for you. So that's all for today. I'll soon be back with another video on a topic of Canadian immigration. Till that time, take very good care of yourself and your families. Bye-bye.